7:40, exactly 7:40, getting started. Yeah, trying to set it, finally trying to set a set break time. All right, we are starting again. Time for talking is now over.
Got it.
Okay, so let's take this router that we've created with so far just the one route, and actually set up our server, right? So far we've created our bare model in the models directory. We've created the bare router in our routes directory. Now we're actually going to create our server.js. It's going to look a little bit different from what we've seen before. The first thing we're going to do, because server is going to be our entry point, right? Yeah, we'll do it the way where we have the index and then the server file, right? Where the index is the thing that actually runs it, right? Kawabunga. The piece that we have to do is we have to first pull in Mongoose. Now we're actually not going to be doing anything with, well, actually we do run a Mongoose connection. We're going to pull in Mongoose here with a require Mongoose. The part that's a little strange is we have to do mongoose.promise equals require bluebird. Right? So we're going to... Apparently I do just forget ease. It's not just with create. Apparently it's just everything. Who needs ease? So we're setting the Mongoose promise library to be bluebird. Mongoose used to have its own promise library, but they've kind of suggested that you no longer use it because there's a lot of better implementations. But they had a pretty rough one when they first started out, and it was just never really designed to go into production. So they would let you use it, but it would console log like a warning saying, "Hey, you probably shouldn't use our promise library. Use one that's actually good." So that's why we have to do this line. Now, because this is the entry point to our server, or to our just app in general, this mongoose.promise will be set for every other place that we require in Mongoose. This has to do with node contexts, or JavaScript contexts, which we're not going to get into today, but I promise we will talk about at some point. It has to do with how node actually gets run. Right, so the promise that we pull in because of the combination of contexts and require caching, the Mongoose that we pull in here is going to be the same Mongoose that we pull in everywhere else. So if we modify it here, it's going to be modified in other places as well.
Does it have to be the first place you're pulling it in?
Yes, because otherwise it won't be modified until you're modifying, like pull in that other file. So if we were to say put the mongoose.promise in our on our models file, for instance, in our bare model, it wouldn't be modified with this promise library until we required in that bare model. We don't actually, I think, need express besides to create app. So I think this should work. We're going to find out. Before we start defining routes, actually, we'll just do it. Where do I want to do this? Let's do a mongoose.connect. I'm going to do process.env.mongo. Actually, let's just do db URL. The reason I'm doing this is for testing. I don't want to connect to my development database in my testing, right? I don't want to start creating and deleting various things in my development database in my test code. I could use env, but I'm not going to use env in this case. I'm just going to create a kind of simpler way of doing it. And if that doesn't exist, we'll do a MongoDB localhost 27017 / bears. Right. So the connect, unlike what we had before, we don't have to pass a callback or do anything with promises involving the actual connect function. Mongoose kind of handles that for us and makes sure that we have actually established a connection. It does things like managing the actual DB object that we got through MongoDB through the native driver. It handles all the managing of that, making sure that we're actually connected before we start doing things to it, and all those bits and pieces. So we don't have to worry about doing those things here. Cowabunga? All right. We have our app. What I'm also going to do, I'm trying to decide if I want app first or routes first. I'm going to pull in the router first, or router second. So we're going to grab the bare router by doing a require on under dir name /routes /bare routes. All right. So what we then do to get this bare router into our app is .use. All right. This .use actually takes a URL, which I almost forgot about. So how this works is this becomes a prefix for all the routes inside of bare router. All right. So when we want to go to /bears from a post to say /bears in our bare router, what's the path that we actually want to hit? Yeah, we want to hit /API/bears with a post. All right, so this just becomes a prefix to whatever we had before. I would recommend versioning, if you're making a production level app, I would recommend versioning your APIs, right? It makes it so much easier to do deprecations or to add new features or to change things once you've built it. This is something that actually Twitter did very wrong at first, was it didn't version its APIs. You'll notice the GitHub API, right, is versioned. It makes it so much easier. No, that's not what I want. GitHub docs, GitHub API docs is what I really want. Yeah. The actual URL that you're hitting for GitHub is actually GitHub v3, right? Although it doesn't tell you because that's a shortcut. But you can access things like api.v2.github, right? Just being able to like change things once you've already built them and call it a new version number for your API is really, really useful. Because like you'll notice things if you ever work with the Twitter API, it has 2 different geolocations for every tweet. One that is latitude, longitude, and one that is longitude, latitude. And it has to do that because the first time they made the API, they did long lat instead of lat long, right? So they had to be able to support all the apps that were built expecting long lat, but they also wanted to fix it to be lat long. So now they just have both. Right? And you'll notice that in a lot of places in the Twitter API. If you version control it, right, you can be like, yeah, version 1 still has the long lat, but now that we're on v2, we fix that and it's lat long, which is the normal convention. But. So versioning your APIs makes being able to deprecate things and change things much, much easier. Because, Twitter was not really meant to be a big thing, right? They didn't expect it to be a big thing. The Linux kernel wasn't expected to be a big thing. Linus Torvalds did it for fun, right? He's just like, I'm going to try this out. I don't think it'll ever be very big. Now it's the biggest software project that's ever existed, right? You don't know what's going to become a big thing, right? It's very difficult to tell what's actually going to blow up. And if you code in some errors in the beginning, and people then build multi-million-dollar businesses based on your API, it becomes very difficult to get rid of those things that they built their business on, right? So we have an app.use v1, API v1 for bare router. Yeah, anyway. And so I'm just going to module.exports this. So that we can then grab it from index. All right, so this is now our server file, or at least before we do a listen. Right, kind of slimmed down, and this is sort of what your API will sort of look like. Right, we could even get rid of this part where we have this const bare router. right, we can get rid of that line and actually just put this in here. All right. Oof. Not exactly what I wanted to do. There we go. Right? We can just do an app.use and require in that bare routes object. But we do actually need the require function. Right? There's no real, we're only using it in one place, so there's not a real reason to save it to a variable. Did I hear someone starting to ask a question?
I have a separate question.
Yeah.
So line 5, the first part, process.env, the db underscore URL will be like something we use for our testing. That's completely separate than this latter half of the.
Yeah, it's going to be something we use for testing and also for Heroku, right? If we deploy this onto Heroku. Yeah. And if that doesn't exist, right? If that environment variable doesn't exist, we're going to use this default.
Which is okay.
Yep.
We'll get to setting up that db URL environment variable.
When we start doing testing. Yeah.
And also line 5, so that connects us to our the database that we use, right?
Yep.
Okay. And we're using, okay, so it's a Mongoose database.
Yep.
All right.
Can you show again where that Mongoose database is actually stored? Like, is it in the file system at the moment, or is that just...
Oh yeah, we'll get into that. We're going to run this in a moment, so we'll go over that. So you mean like where the data is actually put on disk, the
Yeah.
DB folder?
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll go over that in just a moment. And then we'll send in a bear, and then we'll take a look at what it does in the database. The other piece we need, right, to sort of just get this off the ground, is our error handling piece of middleware, right? Which gives us error, rec, res, and next. Remember, this has to have an arity of 4. Right, so your error handling is always going to have an arity of 4, and it should always be the last route in your server. Right, it works the opposite of other pieces of middleware, in that routes before it will dump into this error handling. Any route defined before it, when you call next with something as a parameter in next, will go into this error handling function. Right, and it's only routes that have been previously defined. Whereas normal middleware, remember, will get called for every subsequent route that's defined when we use the .use.
So what I did, I don't know if this is an okay thing to do, but I found I just throw an error within another route, it'll also go into here.
Yep.
Is that
No, that's totally fine.
okay?
You'll see next being the more common convention, just because you can do things like pass that next function into a promise catch. Right, makes it a little bit more useful when you're working with promises, but throwing in error is totally fine.
Okay.
The thing to remember though is that's only going to be that throw. That's only going to happen. It's only going to call this if you're doing that inside of like a middleware or inside of a route, which you shouldn't have code that'll be throwing errors outside of that anyway. But it's just a important thing to remember, right? If I just threw an error like right here,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
that wouldn't get caught by that.
Yeah.
Yeah. We'll call this actually a 404. Error dot. Oh, sorry, I want that in a dot status. Messing that up. There we go. And then I accidentally deleted it. Awesome. So res.status, we'll grab the error.status code or a 404. We'll just kind of assume that this is a 404 if it's not one of those things, which I think should work. No, actually that's not right. It'll be 500 because 404 isn't technically an error. Right? Not finding a page, that's not really an error in the way that we think of like the error handling middleware. It's just a page that wasn't found. If we wanted to create a 404, we do an app.all to like /star, right? as a catch-all at the very end of this. We'll make one of those, but not right this moment. And then we'll res.send error.message or server error. All right, so just like we did Tuesday, yeah, that was Tuesday, we're going to console log the actual error that we got back from the database, right, which we saved in this error objects.error, right? We are going to send back a status code from the error.status code that we set, and we're going to send a message with the error.message. And we have defaults if those two things do not exist, right, with the double or. Cowabunga?
I have a really probably slightly annoying question, but
Okay.
this gives you a linking error because you're not calling next, but you have to have the error be before.
Yep. You can just call next.
Okay.
I mean, it doesn't do anything, right, at this point, so you can just call it. Yeah. But yeah, it's one of those weird situations where you don't use the last parameter, but you need it in there to
Yeah.
define this as a error middleware. It's like, I mean, that's why it doesn't give you one on rec, right? Like, doesn't give you an error for not calling rec, because we do call res, right? And to get to that third parameter, we have to have rec in there.
Yeah.
You could also, another way to get rid of it is you could just do this,
Oh yeah.
right? That works too.
Yeah.
You're only using the error and res objects, so you can just do null and null.
Yeah.
I'm going to leave these labeled just as a reminder of like what they are. But that's an important thing if you, or like a good pattern to sort of know about, right? If there's a parameter that you have to put in there for arity, and you're not going to actually call it, you can just use null, and that's fine. You might forget what it is later on, right? So I tend to name them the things they are, but you know. Cool. Next, we'll create our index.js where we actually start this server. All right, so this is now index.js. I'm probably on Saturday going to figure out a way to make that line where it's showing the file at the top of my screen. I got to do a little bit of research to do it. Vim is not as programmable as something like Emacs, but I'm going to try and move that line where it has whatever file I'm working in to the top of the editor, so it's a little bit more readable. So just as a heads up, your name, spelt right this time, /server dot listen 3000. We'll do a process.env for 3000. All right, so once again, I don't need to save that server into a variable. I can, but I'm not, because I want to get you used to seeing patterns like this. You'll see these a lot in various like node projects. I just need to call the listen on that object, right? So instead of saving it to a const and then calling listen on that const, I'm just requiring it in calling.listen all on one line. Cowabunga? So before I can run this, right, if I try to run this right now, a node index, it's going to give me an error that 27017 is not there. Oh, actually it gives me cannot find routes/bare routes. Let me double check what I called that. Bare router. I'm just going to change the name of that file. MV routes bare router to routes bare routes.js. Right, because I think routes makes a little bit more sense. Router is sort of express specific. I guess this is kind of express specific, but I'm going to call it routes instead. I think that makes more sense. Let's see if we get a different error, which we should. We should get a 27017. Couldn't be created. Instead, I get message unexpected token colon. Oh, I see. So I actually have to put a return in here. It's instead of reading these those brackets as an object literal, right? Instead, it's reading those brackets as the function, right? So something to remember when you're working with arrow functions. I could also do, instead of, actually I don't know if this return will work. Let me find out. I think the return won't. Error, unexpected token return. And an easy way to fix this is just do a new object and use the actual object constructor function. A little way to get around that. Right, now it should return that object, and this one should work. Yeah, now we're getting a different error. So that's something to remember, right? You can't use object literals as in single line error functions because it's going to try to read those brackets as the function brackets rather than the object literal brackets. But if you just wrap it a new object, that totally works, right? Because remember, the object literals is just a shortcut for new object, the object constructor function. Cowabunga?
Why can't we use?
Yeah, so if you just have it like this, right? Instead of reading these two brackets as an object literal, it's expecting a multi-line function. Right?
Like it's looking at this like your state.
Exactly, like as part of that function code. So you could wrap it in another set of brackets, but that kind of seems like overkill. And then if you wrap it in another second set of brackets, you don't get the implied return. So you have to do another thing, and it's a headache. So I tend to just put it in new object. Because we're not just starting it with brackets, right? Because if we need to do multi-line on an arrow function, we have the arrow and then an opening bracket, right? So with new object, it's not reading that as the open bracket of a function, and as instead of something that's going to be returned from that function. Cowabunga on that? Yeah, everyone pretty relatively cowabunga? Cowabunga levels right now on this stuff? Everyone must vote. Everyone vote cowabunga levels.
5 for understanding, 3 for a question.
Yeah.
Now, wouldn't that be a way if you're going to do an object literally, put them like backticks around the curly brace and so we make that?
Yeah, I could do backticks, and then like the problem with the backticks is they'll actually return a string as opposed to an object.
Shut me up. Gotcha.
Yeah, anything that even goes in that like $, whatever, right? The $, opening bracket, closing bracket, all of that at the end, even if you just have backtick and just that'll actually get converted to a string as opposed to being interpreted as an object. Yep. Other questions? No? None at the moment? Okay, so the error we should be getting now is that basically our server is running. I just want to go, I want to show you this error because it's one you'll run into a lot, right? You will definitely forget to start your MongoDB server, right? You'll definitely forget to start MongoDB before you run your server a bunch of times, and just being familiar with what that error looks like is good. All right, so what the important part of this is this econ refused right here, right? What econ refused, when you see it, the most likely situation is that you're not running a database that you're trying to connect to. I'm sure many of you saw this in 301 somewhere, this econ refused during some portion when we were working with SQL. Excuse me. Usually the most common culprit is not connecting to a database, right? And the other call out in this should be the port 27017. Besides it saying Mongo error right here, which is pointing to Mongo as well. The thing you should also be looking for is 27017, right? This is going to be something that you probably run into when you deploy to Heroku and you forget to provision a MongoDB server before trying to run your server, right? You forget that step of the portion, or that portion of the deployment process, and you'll get sort of an obscure bunch of errors, right, that you'll have to find the relevant line to. And the relevant line here is the econ refused and the port number 27017. And I'm saying 27017 a lot because I want you to remember that this is the MongoDB port. It's a little bit more, it's a little bit harder to remember than 5432 for Postgres, right? So I'm going to be saying 27017 a bunch of times to sort of just drill it into your head. What port does Mongo run on?
27017.
Yeah, 27017. All right, so we created this DB folder. Remember, once again, this DB folder should not be committed in your code. It'll get really large really quickly. And when you start running out of disk space on your computer, go through your old projects and delete those DB folders. It'll free up a lot of space. There's a lot of data that gets stored in here, right? The BSON format basically sacrifices hard disk space in order to gain speed, right? There's always trade-offs in computing, right? I'm sure you've run into these a few times, and we're going to be talking about trade-offs a lot as we go. The most common trade-off is speed and storage, right? Or in the case of something like a data structures and algorithms, speed and memory, right? The amount of memory it takes to run an algorithm versus the speed that your algorithm runs in. We'll see some things, especially when we start using hashing, where we'll have like in O of n. Usually when you talk about memory storage, everything's either going to be O of n or O of 1, right, on how much additional things you allocate for. It's not too often that you get asked what the storage O of n is of your algorithm, but it's an important thing to think about, right? We don't get something for nothing unless we had some very bad code written at first, and then you can maybe improve them without losing anything. But the most common trade-off in computing in general is speed versus storage, right? That's a really common trade-off. So BSON sacrifices storage in order to gain speed. Cowabunga? So those DB folders will get very, very large. Don't commit them to GitHub. If I see a DB folder committed on one of your projects for grading, I'm just going to send it back and give you 0 points. Be like, resubmit this. Get rid of that DB, trash your entire GitHub repo, and start over. You won't have to start over writing the code, but you will have to I'll make you delete your repo because it's in the once it's in the history, it's in the history. You got to get rid of it. Or you can do a rebase if you want to get really fancy, but I wouldn't recommend doing a rebase until like a couple years into your actually being in the industry. They're a great way to totally screw over your entire repo. Question?
That's just a git ignore thing, right?
Yep.
Git ignore.
Yeah, add DB to your git ignore. If you do something like yeah, there should be a git ignore in there. I'll just show you my git ignore real quick. Actually, let's pipe that into less. How many people of you remember the cat command? You maybe saw it once in 301. It just concatenates a series of files and outputs them on the terminal, right? So if I run cat, it just outputs what's in that file. So I'm just catting my git ignore, and you'll see the first thing on here is DB. If you just put DB, it'll ignore all the DB subfolders, right? All the DB in your repo. So just remember to add DB to your git ignore, or things will go a little bit crazy. So the way to run, or the way that I usually run Mongo, right? Repo by repo or project by project basis. MongoD -- DB path equals /db. Right? Eventually, I should see waiting for connections on 27017, 27017, 27017. What was that? Yeah, so it's mongod -- DB path equals /db. Yep. Yeah, we did this, would have been last Thursday, a week ago. Yeah, so this is how you run it on a local DB folder. Cowabunga? I'm going to split this terminal screen. You'll see me do this quite a bit from here on out in the class. I'll occasionally be switching between these two things. For instance, right now I'm going to switch it. This is something that tmux allows me to do, by the way. So it's just showing the right half of that split. And then I'm going to run a node server and see if we get any errors, because we shouldn't. Open is deprecated in Mongoose. Use open URI instead, or set use Mongo client option to connect. If using connect or create connection. Okay, so something that I used to teach is now deprecated. This is always fun when I find this out. So we're going to look at the documentation for what we're supposed to actually be using, because the thing that was relevant not that long ago is now apparently deprecated. So let's take a look at where they're pointing us to. This is also something that you'll have to keep on top of when you're actually working in a production level environment. You'll run things that are the way you learned it or what the documentation says for the early stage documentation, but have now been deprecated. Sometimes the documentation gets updated. In the case of Mongoose, since the docs are absolute garbage, they probably have not been quite as updated. But it's telling you with Mongoose versions greater than 4.11.0, you want to use OpenURI instead of open. We didn't anywhere call either open or OpenURI, so we can be relatively certain that this is something that is being used internally by Mongoose. And you'll see it's telling us that if we're using connect, which we are using connect, we want to look at this, this particular web page. All right? So something to keep on top of is deprecation warnings, because eventually they get rid of them. What does the semantic versioning mean again? What are these 4 different numbers? Yeah.
The,
The-
on like the far right.
Yep.
New features would be in the middle.
Yep.
And then like major updates, right?
Yep. Yeah, and if you were in my 301, you'll remember the way I described this is fixes shit, add shit, breaks shit. Right? They'll increase the far right number if it's just a bug fix. If it's a middle number increase, usually that means they're adding things but not taking anything away. If it's the far left number, that means that there's probably a bunch of features being added, as well as some things are being removed. Most likely, not always. All right, so what do they want us to do? Oh, wow, that's weird. So it wants us to do a connect, get a promise from that connect, and then do a dot then with the DB, but we don't really need that. I'm just going to leave it as is. Probably what they want us to do is like grab the promise and then do our server start inside of that promise, which is a good way to, a thing you could do. We're not going to bother with that shit.
It seems like you just pass the use Mongo client through instead of connect. Isn't that just, I think?
I don't think we need that.
Okay.
Yeah, because see,
That's just what the error message says. It says set the use Mongo client.
use opt-in to the new connection logic using the use Mongo client option, but make sure you test your connections first if you're upgrading an existing code base. Yeah, they want us to opt in with this use Mongo client option. Sure, we can do that. Why not? We'll add that. Maybe that'll get rid of the deprecation warning. Let's find out. Ugh, I hate crap like this. We want you to opt into this thing that we're forcing you to do. This is, in my opinion, how not to design a library. If you want us to use this thing, just have it use it by default, and then if we want to use the old version, force us to add an option to use the old version. This is like a pet peeve of mine, is when libraries do shit like this. I think it's stupid. So now we don't get the warning.
Alright, or didn't you start from index.js?
Yep, but I did my Mongoose connection from
Okay.
here. All right. So now,
Go back to that before we added it. That was in the.
yeah, this is on the in server.js in mongoose.connect. This is all they fucking want you to add is this stupid.
Okay, I was just saying what part
Oh
of the
my
process.
god,
Okay.
that's.
I didn't want to rub it in. I was just looking for my.
No, yeah, it's dumb.
I realized I rubbed it in. But
No, it's totally fine. This is just like a pet peeve of mine in code is when they make you do like stupid extra steps. Anyway. Should be, my thought process when I design libraries is it should be easy to do the most common thing that you're likely to do with whatever the library does, and possible to do the more weird and, out there stuff that you might want to use the library for. But the default should always be what you would expect the default to be. Shouldn't have to add additional things to, anyway. It's stupid. I'm just going to sit here and curse for a while. Don't mind me.
we have a 10-minute break coming up.
10-minute curse break. Okay. So, let's actually do this. Let's create an example data directory, because I want to show you something that's really cool you can do with HTTP. So I'm going to create example data, so I don't have to type something out a bunch of times. In example data, I am going to make a bear.json. In here, I'm going to have bear with a name, Yogi. Favorite food, picnic baskets. I don't know Yogi's birthday, so I'm not going to guess. It'll just be right now. This actually should be valid. Just it's highlighting that red. You actually need double quotes for JSON.
What about?
You wrap the JSON.
So if it's a single string on the command line, right, then I have to wrap it in a single string to make sure that we're not trying to execute it as a command line function. Right? So I have inside of the example data that bear.json file. Right? This is kind of contrite to use it for a piece of data that's this simple, but you can imagine like if you had something, say, in your project week project that has like 15, 20 different fields, right, which is not really uncommon, that having to type that into your console every single time you wanted to like create an example bear or something to that nature would get tedious really, really quickly. So this is something cool that you can do that, and I can also use that example data in my testing as well, right? So later on when I want to test this, I can use that same example data. But what this lets me do is cat example data bear.json, right? When I do that, it just gives me that string. So what I can do is then pipe that into HTTP at localhost 3000 /API/v1/bears. Oh, and what I get is HTTP connection pool max retries exceeded with URL. Bad connection error. All right, so I'm getting a server error with the connection refused. Let's see if it crashed my server. It did not. Let's go to server.js. Want to double check that this is /API/1. That should be right for that require bear routes. Let me double check the docs, make sure Express didn't change this as well.
I got that before and I just changed the port number.
Huh. And it worked?
Yeah,
That's weird.
yeah, I don't.
Let me just see if I add localhost if this will. Weird.
I had one formula not work forever, and I switched it and it worked.
Alright, let me do port equals 5000. We'll give that a shot. So I'm just on my, because I had listen to port or to 3000, I'm just going to do port equals 5000 on my single run of node server. And we'll give this another shot. Oh, that's at port 3000 because I didn't update it here. Huh. Oh, you know what it is? Anyone see what I'm doing wrong? What am I running? What am I doing? Anyone catch the error that's happening? Index is where I'm actually calling the app.listen. But I'm running here, I'm running node server as opposed to node index. Can actually just type node and, oh no, I should be able to do node dot and it'll do the same thing. By default, node will run index, right? So if I do node dot and just run the local directory, it'll run index.js because of what I have defined in package.json. And just how node works, it automatically looks for indexes. Yeah, anyway. Okay. Now, if I change it back to 3000, got so many errors that I'm making. So many things to debug. All right. We now see the thing that's created inside of Mongoose. First thing you'll notice is that the underscore ID string is not wrapped in object ID. It just gives us back the string, right? You'll also notice this underscore underscore v with a 0. That's an internal Mongoose thing. It basically allows you to take snapshots of your database and have a way you can export it at certain versions and then roll back if you need to, basically. If you need to roll back your database to a certain version point, you can do that using Mongoose.
I'm sorry, but I saw you make the example data, but I missed how you actually got it.
Totally. I did a cat example data / bear.json, and then did localhost 3000 API v1 bears. If I run this again, what am I going to get? I'm actually going to get an error, right? Because I made the names unique. So if I run this a second time, I should see an error, or my server should crash out. Something's happening, and I'm not getting any feedback. I think that final function is not getting called. That's strange. Okay, we'll debug that in a little bit. Let's go back to, actually we'll debug that now and then we'll go on a break. We'll come back and we'll finish this up. So for some reason, I should be getting an error, but I don't seem to be getting that error call happening. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do after the call to next, I'm going to do a dot catch and console.log that to see if it's getting called there. All right. I'm going to restart my server. What am I getting now? Dot catch, unexpected token. Oh, I put a semicolon in there. Get rid of the semicolon for chaining these together. We'll do node dot. Pipe that in. Are we getting anything? We are not. That is awesome, and by awesome, I mean terrible. Okay. So let's do a console log up here. And see if we can get that to console log before we do this new object thing, which might be the thing that's causing this to not work. And if it is, we'll just call it next right in there as opposed to doing this weird thing that we are doing. Yep, that's where it's dying on me. Okay. But you'll see the Mongo error we're getting, like duplicate key error, bears.bear index, name one, dup key, yogi, right? We already have a yogi in there is what that means, right? We're getting an E110000, duplicate key error, collection, blah, 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 blah. How we're going to fix this is in this error function, we are just going to call next inside of here. We'll do this in one catch as opposed to two. Right. So now we're just calling next with that status code 500, error, blah, 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 some things happening. Let's try this again. There we go. So now we get the error creating bear, and we're actually using our error handling middleware that we created. So what I had to do, how did I just do that? That was a shortcut I didn't know about. That was fun. We're just in that one catch, we are calling the next function and passing in that object. I was hoping to do something trickier and more fun there, mostly to entertain myself, but instead we'll just do it this way. Questions about that? It was still not returning that new object.
So
Basically.
before, why were we even returning the new object on an error? Right, weren't we returning a new object?
So we were trying to wrap basically the error code that we were getting in this object
Inside of
that
it.
also included a status code and a message, because we were using the arrow function shortcut. Right, it was trying to read it as a function as opposed to an object literal, so we wrapped it in the new object. I could probably do it. Let me try one thing just to see if I have a good bead on this, on how this is actually working. I think this should do it, and let me see if that will. I just want to try one thing for my own knowledge real quick. Nope, that doesn't work either. Okay, good to know. Oops. So we'll just call next in there. And pass in that object literal. And that works fine. Questions right now? Yes? No? Okay. We got our server running. We're not going to be able to go over testing today. For testing this. It should be very similar to how you test it, or at least I don't think we'll have time to go over testing. But it should be pretty similar to how you tested other HTTP servers that you created for the class. I'll try to go over it on Saturday at some point, probably after lunch, right? So you'll have the morning to work on the first lab, and then we'll cover testing this, and then it'll be afternoon lab, so probably sometime around 1 we can go over testing on this, if that works for everyone. Cool. All right, let's go on another quick break. We'll come back at 8:40, and I will start right at 8:40.